To you today about the history of the Irish language. Okay, so yeah, let's get started. So anyway, the Irish language has been spoken on this island for over 2,500 years. It's a Celtic language, and it was first brought to Ireland by the Celts. Okay, now who were the Celts exactly? Well, the Celts were a group of tribal peoples who lived in continental Europe, um, around the sort of Austria, Switzerland sort of territory, that kind of territory, southern Germany, and eastern France, right about 2,500 years ago, approximately. Okay, and they arrived in Ireland at about 600 BC, right before Christ. So Irish was spoken by most people in Ireland until the late 19th century. Okay, and according to the 1911 census, a majority of people still spoke the language in Cork and in Waterford, for example, and in Kerry. Okay, so it would have been in this part of the country, it would have still, at the start of the last century, it would have been still very widely spoken. Okay, so what's this here? You've seen a lot of these stones, maybe in the stone corridor as well in UCC. Um, and if you look at the little scratches or notches, the little cuttings on the side of it, well, that it's a writing system. So this is an Ogham stone. It's on these kind of Ogham stones that you will see the earliest examples of written Irish. So Ogham, anyway, was a simple writing system used to display the letters by cutting little notches into the side of a stone like that, a freestanding stone. So, for example, you would have a series of little dashes for A, and then another series of little dashes for B, etc. Okay, so if you go to the stone corridor in the quad when UCC opens, you'll be able to go and visit some of the stones there, and you'll be able to read the translations of what it says on them. Anyway, these are the earliest examples of written Irish, and Ogham stones were mostly used. The ones that we still have were mostly used to display people's names on grave sites, for example, or to show the limits of a petty king's territories, um, or for kind of more kind of formal reasons, let's say. Now, there may have been other. It may have been used, or probably would have been used, on wood as well. But because wood perishes very quickly, we don't have any from that type period now. So these Ogham stone carvings, they can be found all over the country, and they mostly date, the ones that have been found, they mostly date from the 400s and 500s AD. And actually, UCC in the Stone Corridor, we have the biggest collection of Ogham stones in the world. So after that, the Roman letters took over after the arrival of Christianity. So with the arrival of Christianity, but also before that, because Ireland was just on the edge of the Roman Empire. Britannia was a Roman province that was just next door to us, and we know that there was a lot of trade going on between Ireland and the Roman province of Britannia, and we have found a lot of Roman coins in the country, and we know that there were a lot of Roman merchants that were based here and that were trading. Okay, so anyway, the golden age of literature in Irish started at around 400 AD. So when Irish began to be written in Roman letters around then, and up until the 17th century, there was a massive amount of literature produced in the language. Poems were written down, biographies of saints were composed, annals, or what are kind of like newspapers or records of events of the time. They were all written down in Irish. Also, law texts, for example, philosophical treatises, books of medicine, and many other things. Adventure stories and folklore as well, that had been passed down by word of mouth, and mythology, for example. If you remember my lecture about Irish mythology a couple of months ago, if anybody was there, so some of those stories, one of the stories that we looked at, Tyne Bo Cúailnge, or the cattle raid of Coolay, that was a story that was originally passed on by word of mouth, but then was written down, and it was written down in Irish. So translations were also done of Latin, French, Greek, and English texts, and so like, for example, Greek mythology and French troubadour songs and things like that. These are all translated into Irish and written down. So anyway, a decline in Irish literature started from the beginning of the 17th century onwards for political reasons. Well, I won't go too much into the politics of it today, but the start of the decline of Irish was started really in 1601 with the loss of the Battle of Kinsale by the Irish, and that meant that the English had a very strong foothold in the country. And then in the middle of the 17th century, you had the Cromwellian invasions. Oliver Cromwell came over and, basically destroyed the country, and produced a massive famine and enslaved a lot of the people, of the Irish people as well, and sent them off to be slaves in the sugar plantations in the Caribbean. And then in the 19th century, you had the Williamite Wars between King James and King William. Okay, so by the end of the 17th century, English was firmly established as the language of government, as the language of the authorities, of the language of the cities, the language of business. And Irish started, it was still spoken by the vast majority of people in the country, but it started to not be spoken by those in power. So the very select few that were in power in Dublin, for example, they didn't speak the language any longer. So Irish has been influenced by other European languages as well. So with the arrival of Christianity, and the contact with the Roman Empire, as I mentioned, many people arrived in the country that spoke Latin, and a huge number of words were absorbed into Irish from Latin at this time. So, for example, do you know where these words came into Irish from Latin? Now I'll translate them. Aglish is church, okay, and then it's similar to the English word ecclesiastical, okay. So ecclesiastical is the adjective of the church. Then litter has a cognate in English, letter, okay. So that comes from Latin as well. And scriev is similar to, for example, scrivere in Italian, or scribir in Spanish, okay? So scriev. All right, so three of those words came into Irish from Latin. Then the Vikings arrived in 795, and they had a few loan words as well were taken from Old Norse. So Old Norse was the language that was spoken by the Vikings. Now the Vikings that arrived in Ireland were mostly Norwegian. Those who came to, for example, Eastern England were mostly Danish. But the languages that they spoke would have been quite similar. So these words came from Old Norse. So the Vikings were great traders. They have infamy in Ireland as being pillagers and rapists and thieves and murderers, and but they eventually settled down in the country and they became traders, and they built some of the first kind of trading towns like Cork and Waterford and Dublin, for example. They were originally kind of founded as Viking trading towns. So Bod, which is boat in Irish, so that comes from Old Norse. So does Pinin or penny you have in English, and then Maraga or market too. So all of these kind of words connected with economics and trade. Okay, then the Normans came to Ireland in 1169 and they brought principally French with them, but some in their retinue, so some of their soldiers or the other kind of villagers or crafts people that were in their the group of people following them would have spoken Welsh, Flemish, and English. So gradually, however, the Normans in Ireland, they learned Irish. Okay, so a Norman family who were traditional landowners in this part of Cork, they were called the Roaches, and their language was French. And if you go down to Roaches Court, which is just down in Carricktool, you can go and you can visit the old Barry's Court. Excuse me, the Barry's. So the Barry's Court down in Carricktool, you can visit Barry's Court Castle, which was the old Barry family stronghold, and then they built a new house in the latter half of the 18th century, early 19th century, which is now Fota House. And that Fota House is still in existence, is now a museum. But on the territory now there's a golf club and there's a big kind of fancy hotel as well there. But anyway, on the entrance into the hotel you will see in French it says Buvez en avant. So this is strive forward, okay, and that was their motto on the Barry family coat of arms. And there's a town in Cork as well that was in the Barry territory, which is called Buttevant. So Boute en avant comes from so that motto gives rise to the Irish, to the name of that Irish town, to the Cork town. So Buttevant, just in North Cork. Okay, so you will pass through Buttevant if you're on the way to Limerick, for example. So Irish was still very, very strong in the country until the end of the 16th century. Okay, because the Normans, in spite of being French speakers, they learned Irish after a while, and they started, passing the language onto the next generation. And of course, they would have married into local Gaelic families. They would have married local women, for example, and of course, the hand that rocks the cradle rules the world, as they say. So those Irish-speaking mothers would have brought up their Norman sons to speak Irish as well. So anyway, these words come from Norman French. So we have the Irish word for room is seomra, like an seomra cadriv that you have, for example, in the ORB. So seomra is from chambre, okay, CHAMBRE, right, the French for room. Collage, collage, okay, and hospital or hôpital, hospital, okay. So they all came into Irish from French. So anyway, the decline of Irish started from the 17th century, from the early 17th century onwards. So the old Irish speaking landowning class were broken at that stage after Kinsale, and particularly Cromwell and the Williamite Wars. So most of the native Irish people, the vast majority of them, they lost their land, and there was a huge shift in land ownership. And by the end of the 17th century, the Irish only owned less than 10% of the land in the country, and at the beginning of the 17th century that it would have owned like 90%. So their lands were taken and they were given to English and lowland Scottish planters or colonizers or settlers. So English common law then was enforced throughout the kingdom, English was now the language of these new landowners, and they brought up their children through Irish. And Highland Scots, for example, who spoke Irish or Scottish Gaelic, as it's called today, were not allowed to settle in Ireland, only the lowland English speaking Scots. And when they arrived as well, they had a different language. Or sorry, as well as having a different language, they had a different religion. They were either members of the Church of England, of the Anglican Church, or they were Presbyterians or Calvinists. Okay, so they would have been coming with these Protestant faiths that were different from the Irish, who were almost exclusively Catholic. So from 1537 onwards, the British government started building schools in Ireland. Now, English was the only language of instruction in these schools, and also you couldn't attend these schools if you were Catholic. So this, for any of the native Irish, that made it impossible for them to attend these schools. And also the schools weren't free; they were expensive. And then the Great Famine, which took place in Ireland from 1845 to 52, was another severe body blow to the language. So Irish was the language of of the poor rural peasants at that time, and at least 1 million of them died during these years, and a further 1.5 million were forced into exile, so they emigrated, principally to the United States and Canada. So this phenomenon especially hit Western countries. So a lot of the Western counties lost, nearly half of their populations. Um, and this was the area where the language was most strong at the time. So this resulted in a massive fall in the numbers of not just people, but especially Irish speakers of the language. So the people in the west of the country that tended to survive the famine were the wealthier, kind of more urban English speaking people. So, for the first time in history, at the end of the famine, since the arrival of the Celts in 1600, in 600 BC, Irish became a minority language in its homeland. So then in 1831, the national school system was set up in Ireland. So for the first time, English was freely available. Or sorry, for the first time, not English, but education was, that's a mistake there. Education was freely available to kids between the ages of 6 and 14. And of course, the language of these schools was in English. Okay, so there was no Irish speaking in these schools at all. So even though most of the pupils didn't speak this language at all, so 1831, this is before the famine, a good kind of, let's say, 20 years or so before the famine. So the vast majority of the kids going to these schools, particularly in the west of the country, wouldn't have heard English ever before, except when they went to school. And the way that they did it as well is they found teachers that could only speak English to go and teach in the principally Irish speaking areas, to make sure that the teachers wouldn't be using any Irish. Okay, so because the British authorities did not want to promote the language in any way. So teachers were told to make sure that the kids didn't speak Irish in class. And in order to do that, there was this thing that they had. So they had on Bata score. So the Bata score is a tally stick. So basically, this was used to force the new language onto the students. So the kids had to wear this thing around their neck, right? They had to wear this stick, if you like, around their necks, or this tally stick. Anytime they spoke Irish, there was a notch put in the stick by the teacher. And then at the end of the school day, then pupils were lashed or they were beaten for every one of these notches. Now, often as well, when the students went home to their parents, the parents would give them another few lashes, so another 6 lashes or 10 lashes or whatever number of notches they had on their stick. Now, why were the parents so against the language, even though the parents would have been native speakers of Irish? Well, they were desperate for their kids to learn English and to not speak Irish at all, because Irish was associated with poverty, with backwardness, with economic hardship, etc. So here's some evidence of the tally stick being used, right? So this was written by, this is from the National Folklore Collection, which you can find at www.duchas.ie, and this is an account of somebody talking about the tally stick and the tally stick being used on them. And it was written down in 1933. Now, down at the bottom it says Ballynamona, which is in Waterford, and it's the name of the person who wrote it down, right? So he would have been a school child at the time when he wrote it down. His name is Padraig O'Cruleen. So Pat Curran, and he said, Maher a hug an tola shot dum. So my father gave me this information. Okay, so what he says is, I'll say the Irish version and then I'll translate it. So Nurvi ma chan ahar ag dollar skull viakshe ag laurt gwelna. So when my great grandfather, or when my grandfather was going to school, he would be speaking Irish. Agus chorach bata score timple a vinil. Agus lawer she de vocal gwelna. Okay, so there was a tally stick put around his neck, and if he spoke 10 Irish words, agus chorach de giara savata, so there would be 10 notches put onto the stick. So agus an aig gach fachil is an son chorach tevamwe don dara say. So there would be one piece of one notch for every word of Irish that he spoke, and then he would be put out the door, and then your chuig sé valya agus hug ahar builado in oig gach in gara a vir and vata. So his father, so the child's great grandfather, would have got beaten for each notch that was on the stick. Okay, so pretty harsh the way that happened. Okay, so you can find other stories like that as well if you go into the National Folklore Collection. Okay, so the revival of the English, or of the Irish language, started towards the end of the 19th century. So the language shift from Irish to English accelerated, particularly in the second half of the 19th century. There were 800,000 native speakers left according to the 1891 census, and the number of speakers was falling perilously each year. The ordinary people were doing everything they could possibly do to learn English in order to progress economically and make a better life for themselves. So to communicate with the government, for example, the authorities, to find work in the bigger towns, and to emigrate to North America. So in 1893, Douglas Douglas Hyde, and Owen MacNeill and others created the Irish League, or Conradh na Gaelna. So the aim of this organisation was to promote Irish language and culture. So Conradh na Gaelna encouraged Irish music and dancing. They published books in Irish, and they also put on Irish language classes in different parts of Ireland, so, and abroad as well. So Douglas Dahida was also, as well as being the first president of the Irish League, or Conradh na Gaelna, he was later to become the first president of the Republic of Ireland. So one of the most important things that Conradh na Gaelna did is that they created their own newspaper to put forward and progress their aims and goals. This paper was called An Clive Solish, or the Sword of Light. So what date is on this copy? So it says 1916. So what can you see in the picture? Well, in the picture there, you're going to have to zoom in, maybe a little bit, pause me and zoom in. That is Dublin city centre having been destroyed by British gunboats and by the British Army. in 1916 following the Easter Rising. So you see people being left out on the street for the first time in over a week or so after the rebels had been destroyed. Excuse me. So anyway, you can find more copies of this old newspaper on there, but that was one of the most important achievements of Conradh na Gaelna, to put that Irish language newspaper out. And then there is also a membership card here from Conradh na Gaelna, so you see it written in the old Irish text. And anyway, this card was produced, you can probably see it in 1893 to 1894, and it says on it, Ní éireannach Gaeilgeoir, so you're not Irish until you're an Irish speaker, and is onan gan teanga agus bheith gan tír. So it's the same thing to not have a language and not have a country, right? So language and country are very much reflections of one another. So two of those are written on the card. Do you agree with these statements? So anyway, Irish today. Most students in Ireland today study Irish in school, although not everybody, but the vast majority of people, and also many people do in Northern Ireland. There are nearly 500 Irish medium schools in the country, and these provide education through the medium of Irish.